Judge Alistair Vance was confident he was about to sentence another clueless teenager, right up until the moment that defendant began to systematically dismantle the entire case with the precision of a master litigator. The air inside the Sterling City Grand Courthouse hung heavy, a thick, almost palpable pressure that seemed to suffocate the room. Spectators packed the gallery, their hushed murmurs a restless tide of anticipation as they watched the drama unfold. At the defendant's table, a young man stood seemingly dwarfed by the imposing furniture, yet his posture, hands tucked casually in his pockets, chin tilted just so, broadcast a quiet defiance. Kaelen Shaw, 19 years old, was facing charges of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The accusations were grave, but the condescending gaze of Judge Vance made it painfully clear that the true battle being waged had little to do with the letter of the law. Vance leaned back, the slow, rhythmic drumming of his fingers on the polished wood a display of bored authority. He peered down at Kaelen, his glasses perched on the end of his nose, his lips curling into a smug, dismissive sneer. "You fancy yourself some kind of legal scholar?" His voice dripped with a dry, patronizing amusement. "This isn't a high school debate team, son." A wave of sycophantic chuckles rippled through the courtroom, from the bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They were all part of the performance, but Kaelen didn't even blink. He wasn't amused. He had spent his entire life unknowingly preparing for a moment just like this. Not this specific moment, of course. He never envisioned himself as the one on trial. Yet he knew the intricate dance of the courtroom intimately. While other kids were memorizing sports statistics, he was memorizing legal precedents. While they mastered video games, he conducted intricate mock trials inside his own, mind-arguing complex imaginary cases against himself. His mother, Elara Shaw, had been a paralegal for over 2 decades, and Kaelen's childhood was a tapestry woven from the stories she brought home, tales of prosecutors who bent the rules, judges who played favorites, and defense attorneys who simply went through the motions. He soaked it all in. By 14, he could dissect a legal proceeding with more skill than most law school students. But none of that history mattered to Judge Vance. To him, Kaelen was just another statistic, another kid from the wrong side of the tracks. "Let's get this over with," the judge sighed, theatrically flipping open the case file. "I have a tea. Time at 2. The gallery chuckled again, but this time the atmosphere subtly shifted. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched Kaelen's lips, because Judge Vance, in his arrogance, had just made his first critical error. The courtroom just hadn't realized it yet. The prosecutor, Julian Croft, rose to his feet, cloaked in the unassailable confidence of a man who believed the victory was already his. His suit was impeccably tailored, his tie was a perfect knot of silk, and his voice resonated with the rehearsed, booming certainty of someone who had delivered this very speech 100 times before. "Your Honor," he began, "the state will prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Kaelen Shaw, was apprehended red-handed behind the wheel of a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Apex A6, reported missing just hours prior to his arrest. Officers engaged in a pursuit through the downtown sector, where he dangerously attempted to flee before finally being taken into custody. His fingerprints, Your Honor, were discovered all over the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that. The evidence is not just compelling, it speaks for itself." The words settled over the courtroom with a declarative weight. In the gallery, bodies shifted and whispers grew louder. On the surface, the narrative was damning. A stolen luxury car, a high-speed chase, a desperate flight from the law. Judge Vance glanced at Kaelen over the top of his glasses before turning his attention back to Croft. "Proceed." The prosecutor began a slow, deliberate walk toward the jury box, the sharp click of his polished leather shoes echoing on the floor. "The defense," he projected, may attempt to persuade you that this is all a simple misunderstanding, that Mr. Shaw is merely an unfortunate victim of circumstance." He paused, turning to lock eyes with Kaelen for the very first time. "But let us be brutally honest with ourselves. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room coiled tighter. Judge Vance leaned forward now, resting his chin on his clasped hands, a flicker of interest in his eyes. Kaelen remained perfectly still, his gaze unwavering. Croft continued, rifling through a stack of documents. "Your Honor, I have in my hand the sworn testimony of Officer Marcus Thorne, who personally witnessed the defendant operating the vehicle just before he attempted his reckless escape. The car's status as stolen was confirmed. The arrest was executed by the book." Vance nodded, exhaling through his nose. "Sounds rather straightforward to me." And for almost everyone in that room, it probably did. The case seemed open and shut. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. But Kaelen had devoted too many years to studying the theater of the trial not to see the hairline fractures in the foundation of the prosecution's story. Still, he held his silence, watching, waiting. Judge Vance gave a light tap of his gavel. "Very well. Let's hear the defense's response." He gestured toward Kaelen's court-appointed lawyer, a public defender named Amelia Finch, who had barely uttered 3 words since the proceedings began. She stood, shifting her weight nervously. "Your Honor, my client—" Kaelen placed a gentle but firm hand on her arm, a silent command. She paused, looked at him, and then, with a flicker of confusion, sat back down. And for the first time, Kaelen's voice filled the room. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The courtroom fell into a sudden, profound silence. Vance stared, a look of genuine amusement spreading across his face. "You'll be what?" Kaelen's voice was calm, clear, and steady. "I will be defending myself." A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Croft's confident smirk faltered for a heartbeat before he recovered with a sharp, derisive laugh. "Well," he quipped, "this ought to be entertaining." But nobody was laughing when Kaelen took his first deliberate step forward. Because in that single moment, the entire dynamic of the room was about to change. The collective weight of every stare in the courtroom seemed to settle on Kaelen as he adjusted his position. His hands found their way back into his pockets, a picture of unnerving calm. He let the silence hang in the air, stretching it just long enough to make everyone feel it, to make them lean in. Then, finally, he spoke. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to confirm a small detail with the prosecution." Croft, arms crossed, raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Be my guest." Kaelen took a measured step toward him. "You stated that Officer Marcus Thorne personally witnessed me behind the wheel before the arrest occurred. Is that correct?" Croft let out a sharp, bored sigh. "That's what I said." "And that testimony is documented in his official report?" "Of course it is." Kaelen nodded slowly, thoughtfully, then turned his gaze to Judge Vance. "Your Honor, I move to have that testimony dismissed as inadmissible evidence." Vance squinted down from the bench. "On what grounds, Mr. Shaw?" For the first time, Kaelen pulled his hands from his pockets, using one to gesture toward the prosecutor's table. "On the grounds that Officer Thorne never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the pursuit allegedly began." A ripple of confusion washed over Croft's face. "What are you talking about?" Kaelen advanced another step. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to submit a formal request to subpoena Officer Thorne's GPS logs from the night in question. If his report is accurate, and he truly witnessed me in that vehicle, then his location history will corroborate his story perfectly. But," he let the word hang, heavy with implication, "I have a distinct feeling that it won't." Now the murmurs in the gallery were no longer whispers, they were audible. Vance's expression hardened as he glanced at Croft. "Counselor?" Croft cleared his throat, his jaw visibly tightening. "That report was filed by a decorated officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we seriously going to entertain the baseless accusations of a defendant over the word of a trained professional?" Kaelen offered a small, almost casual shrug. "If the officer was where he says he was, the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't—" He left the conclusion unspoken, letting the silence do the work. Vance studied him, a long, searching look, before turning back to the prosecutor. "Does the prosecution have any objection to verifying the officer's GPS records?" Croft hesitated. The pause was brief, but it was just long enough. Long enough for the jury to notice, long enough for the gallery to notice, and most critically, long enough for the judge to notice. Kaelen took a slow, quiet breath. He had spent countless hours watching trials, studying the subtle tells of prosecutors, their tactics, the way they leveraged the system. And he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If Croft was truly confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling now. Vance sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Counselor!" Croft finally shook his head. The words clipped. "No objections, Your Honor." But the tide had already turned. For the very first time that day, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The room was still, but the tension was a roaring in everyone's ears. Julian Croft shuffled his papers, his polished facade beginning to crack at the seams. "Your Honor, while we await those GPS records, the undeniable fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Kaelen gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "That is true," he conceded, taking another step forward. "But let's talk about that evidence for just a moment." Judge Vance raised an eyebrow, a silent gesture for him to continue. Kaelen turned not to the judge, but to the jury, and began to make eye contact with each of them one by one. "The prosecution wants you to believe a very simple story, that finding my fingerprints inside a car automatically means that I must have stolen it. That's the neat little package they're trying to sell you. But let's apply a little logic to this, shall we?" He took a deep, calming breath, his tone remaining even and controlled. "Imagine you walk into a department store, you see a jacket you like, and you try it on. You slide your hands into the pockets, maybe you test the zipper. Then you decide against it, place it back on the rack, and leave the store. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that very same jacket. Would the simple fact that your fingerprints are on it mean that you are the thief?" A few jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Someone in the gallery mumbled in agreement. Kaelen didn't let the moment fade. The car in question was parked outside a corner mart for hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 of my friends. And yes, he admitted freely. When we walked past the car on our way out, I leaned against it. I even pulled the handle and opened the door because it was already unlocked. It was a stupid, curious impulse. I didn't think anything of it. I didn't take the car, didn't drive the car, didn't steal a single thing from inside it. He let that statement settle in the quiet room. Then, with a voice that cut through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Croft cleared his throat loudly, frantically flipping through his notes, searching for anything that could help him regain his footing. But Kaelen wasn't finished. "And while we're on the subject, let's discuss how that fingerprint analysis was conducted." He turned back to Vance. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist who handled this case ever subpoenaed to testify today?" Vance blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. He looked to Croft for an answer. The prosecutor hesitated, then answered reluctantly, "No." Kaelen's lips pressed into a firm line. "So allow me to clarify. The state is using forensic evidence as a cornerstone of its attempt to convict me, but they didn't feel it was necessary to bring in the actual expert who processed that evidence. You provide no opportunity for me to cross-examine, to ask about the chain of custody, or to challenge the methods and accuracy of the analysis itself. Croft's jaw was a knot of tension. Kaelen nodded, as if that was the only answer he ever expected. Interesting. Judge Vance let out a heavy sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was the expression of a man who was rapidly realizing that this supposedly open and shut case was anything but. But Kaelen wasn't done, not by a long shot. Because the next words he was about to speak would detonate the prosecution's case completely, Kaelen took another deliberate step forward, his voice remaining steady, but now infused with an unshakable firmness. "Your Honor, I would like to enter into evidence an official statement taken from the owner of the vehicle." Judge Vance frowned. "The owner?" Kaelen nodded. "Yes. Mr. Silas Blackwood, the registered owner of the stolen Apex, provided a detailed statement to the police, a statement that, for some curious reason, was never included in the prosecution's filings. And I think I'm beginning to understand why." He turned his gaze directly to a stunned Julian Croft. "Do you happen to recall what Mr. Blackwood told the responding officers on the night his car was reported stolen?" Croft's jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle jumped in his cheek. He knew precisely what was coming. Kaelen didn't wait for a response he knew would never arrive. Instead, he produced a printed transcript from a file on his table and began to read aloud, his voice clear and resonant. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have just jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, a single sharp intake of breath. Kaelen held the paper aloft. "This is from the original police report. The very same report that the prosecution conveniently neglected to mention." He turned back to Judge Vance, his eyes blazing. The arresting officer heard this testimony from the victim. The prosecution was aware of it. And yet, they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even remotely match the description of the actual thief, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Croft scrambled forward, his voice strained. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was found in possession of the vehicle." "No," Kaelen cut him off. His voice didn't rise, but it sliced through the courtroom with absolute precision. "I wasn't. I was arrested several blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I was not in the car. I was not near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only things tying me to this case are shoddy police work and a rush to judgment." Judge Vance let out a long, slow breath, rubbing his temple. The case wasn't just unraveling. It had completely fallen apart, and everyone in the room knew it. Kaelen turned back to face the jury one last time. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and simply decided that was close enough. That is what this case is really about. Silence. A heavy, profound silence. Vance cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Does the prosecution have anything further to add?" Croft stood rigid, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "No, Your Honor." Judge Vance exhaled, his gaze fixed on Kaelen for a long, contemplative moment. He glanced at the jury, then at the scattered papers before him. Finally, he leaned forward into his microphone and spoke the two words that would echo in the minds of everyone present. "Case dismissed." A beat of stunned silence, and then the courtroom erupted into controlled chaos. A wave of disbelief and quiet relief washed over the gallery as spectators began to stir, reporters furiously scribbling in their notebooks. Kaelen didn't move immediately. He stood his ground, allowing the moment to settle, letting the profound reality of what had just happened sink in for everyone. Judge Vance, still clutching his gavel, looked at Kaelen with an expression that was no longer readable. The arrogance, the amusement, it was all gone. In its place was something new, recognition, perhaps even a hint of regret. Kaelen met his gaze, then turned to walk away. But just as he reached the gate, the judge's voice stopped him. "Mr. Shaw." Kaelen paused, but didn't turn around. Vance hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You should seriously consider law school." A small smirk touched Kaelen's lips. He didn't need to consider it. He was already there. Outside on the courthouse steps, the air was a whirlwind of voices. Reporters swarmed him, a frantic hive of activity. Cameras flashed like lightning, and microphones were thrust forward like weapons. "Kaelen, did you know the judge would throw out the case? What are your plans now? How does it feel to outwit a veteran prosecutor?" Kaelen simply pulled the hood of his sweatshirt over his head, letting the questions wash over him. He had no interest in the spectacle. This was never about proving his own intelligence. It was about exposing a fundamental flaw. His mother, Ilara, was waiting for him at the bottom of the steps. Her arms were crossed, her expression a mask of stoicism. For a long moment she just looked at him, taking him in. Finally she shook her head and released a breath she seemed to have been holding all day. "Boy, you scared me half to death in there." Kaelen chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "Had to take the risk, Ma." She stared at him for another second, the hard lines of her face softening, and then she pulled him into a fierce, protective hug. "You always were the stubborn one." The cameras continued to flash, but Kaelen was no longer aware of them. Across the street, standing beside his sedan, Judge Alistair Vance watched the scene. His posture was different now, the rigid arrogance replaced by something more contemplative. His expression held no amusement, only a deep, unsettling reflection. He had walked into his courtroom that morning, expecting another routine proceeding, another defendant, another easy conviction. But he knew now that he would remember this case. He would remember Kaelen Shaw. Because Kaelen had done something few people ever managed to do. He had forced the system to look at itself in the mirror, and for once, the system had blinked first. And that is the lesson we must all take away from this. How many other cases have proceeded just like this one? How many other individuals have been convicted, not on the basis of irrefutable evidence, but on the treacherous grounds of bias, procedural shortcuts, and a system that often prioritizes closing cases over discovering the truth? Kaelen possessed the knowledge to fight back, to turn the system's own rules against it. But what about all the others who don't? This was never just about one stolen car or one wrongful accusation. It was about every single one of them. He knew, with absolute clarity, what he had to do next. This would not be the last courtroom he stood in, but the next time he entered one, he wouldn't be standing at the defendant's table. He would be the one standing for the defense, and when that day comes, he won't be alone. If this story made you stop and think, even for a single second, then share it. The justice system is built on a foundation of laws, but it is operated by people, and people can change, but they only change when we demand it. Hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo, and let's keep this conversation going, because next time it might not be a stranger like Kaelen on trial. It might be someone you know.